Alright, Standard 5e, explain the importance of the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. There's that semicolon. Include, there's that magic word again, the Whiskey Rebellion, non-intervention in Europe, and the development of political parties, and it has in parentheses Alexander Hamilton. So the first president we want to talk about is George Washington. If you remember, he presided over the Constitutional Convention, overcame many obstacles during the American Revolutionary War and the crossing of the Delaware and all those obstacles he had. He never gave up. He showed leadership as a military leader. And in 1789, after the Constitution had been ratified, the first electoral college elected him unanimously President of the United States. He received 69 of the electoral college votes, and those were all of the electoral college votes. The vice president was elected separately, and if you look down here on this map, John Adams received 34 votes of the 69 out of all these candidates, and he becomes vice president of the United States. Alright, explain the importance of presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. Include the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion is important for us to understand. Here it is highlighted. Let's first talk about what happened in the Whiskey Rebellion. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of Treasury under George Washington, passes an excise tax on liquor. And out in western Pennsylvania, some farmers were growing some grains and they had stills, and they were making liquor and whiskey, and this is going to anger a lot of these farmers in western Pennsylvania. And these angry farmers go out and tar and feather tax collectors, pour tar over them, throw feathers on them. It took a lot of skin off when that come off, killed a lot of them. They went out and stopped court proceedings just like Daniel Shays did, but this was the Whiskey Rebellion. And they blew up the stills of the people who paid the taxes. And the still was a mechanized machine that they made to make the whiskey with, or liquor with. And then George Washington's going to respond. He's going to call out 12,900 militiamen to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, to put it down. And he's successful. He rides out on the horse with the militiamen, and they end the Whiskey Rebellion quite quickly. And it shows his role as commander-in-chief, a strong executive. He's able to take force against rebellion. And here's a portrait of George Washington leading his troops in the Whiskey Rebellion out in western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. The Whiskey Rebellion, unlike Shays' Rebellion, is going to show that and Shays' Rebellion showed that the country needed a stronger government under the Articles. It's going to be one of the reasons that led to a call for a stronger central government. But the Whiskey Rebellion is going to show that the country under the Constitution, under this new government we formed under the Constitution, was strong. And a visual I use is this one. And here's Articles of Confederation. Here's Daniel Shays' Rebellion. It showed that the government was weak under the Articles. And Whiskey Rebellion, we tell our kids, you know, when you drink whiskey you think you're strong. That's the way you can remember it. Rebellion, we the people of the Constitution, under the Constitution, Whiskey Rebellion showed the government was strong. Under Shays' Rebellion, Articles of Confederation, the government was weak. That's how you compare the two, keep them separate. Okay. Explain the importance of the presidency of George Washington and John Adams. In George Washington's administration, the non-intervention in Europe. George Washington's going to have a two-term president. It establishes this precedent, or this custom, where presidents only serve for 2 terms in office. And a term in office is 4 years. 1 term is 4 years. 2 terms is 8 years as president of the United States. And every president from George Washington to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in 1932 is going to serve no more than 8 years, or 2 terms. And then FDR was elected to 4 terms, and he died in his 4th term. But the 22nd Amendment is going to, after FDR dies, the 22nd Amendment is going to be ratified. It's going to limit the president to 2 terms. It's going to be made law or constitutional. Only 2 terms can be served as president. George Washington gave his farewell address when he left the presidency, and he as president, he kept the United States neutral during conflicts between Great Britain and France. And so he warned against entangling alliances, making alliance with either country. And he thought that the country needed time to grow and not build or entangle alliances with other nations. George Washington also warned against creating political parties or factions within the country. The country could possibly fight within and weaken the country or have a civil war, he thought. And we'll look at some of that. His Neutrality Proclamation, within his farewell address, the Neutrality Proclamation, here's what he wrote. The great rule of conduct for us, talking about the United States, in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connections as possible. So far, we have already formed engagements. Let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop. In other words, let's not have excessive political connections with nations. Let's avoid those entangling alliances. Avoid being friends with one nation in war against another. Because we were a new country, we needed time to grow. Let's worry about our commercial relations. Let's worry about selling stuff to all nations and not connecting to them too much. Alright, so he warns us here, don't get involved in other nations' affairs. Don't side with them and war with one another. Okay, and here's a warning about political parties in his farewell address. George Washington said, the alternate domination of one faction over another. There's that word faction. We talked about how James Madison defined that word. Sharpened by the spirit of revenge, is itself a frightful despotism. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. It kindles the animosity of one part against another, a fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming it should consume. And a lot of people say right here he's talking about he's pretty much being prophetic and saying it could lead to a civil war here. A fire not to be quenched. And as we go in Unit 3 and 4, actually Unit 4, we're going to see northern and southern parties go at one another and inflame one another and lead into a bursting of the country into this secessionist flame, separating one another. Alright, and then it says, explain the importance of the presidency of John Adams. So we need to talk about him. And in him we talk about the Federalist era. The second president of the United States was John Adams. He was a Federalist. He passed a series of laws where the United States citizens were put in prison and their property was seized if they spoke out against the government, the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act, here it says that it shall be lawful for the President of the United States at any time during the continuance of this act to order all such aliens as he shall judge dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States, and shall have reasonable grounds to suspect are concerned in any treasonable or secret machinations against the government thereof, to deport out of the territory of the United States within such time, or shall be expressed in such order. In other words, this law these laws like this were a series of laws where the aliens could be deported by the president without due process for any reason he thought just. And Thomas Jefferson argued that the Alien Acts were an attack on the Democratic Republican Party or Democratic Republican group, and said that many of the aliens that were foreigners would vote were voting Democratic Republican rather than Federalist. And the Sedition Act was where the president could imprison citizens for speaking, writing, or printing any statement that would bring him, the president, or any other politician of the government into contempt or disrepute. And here's a little extract from the Sedition Act. That if any person shall be unlawfully combined or conspire together with intent to oppose any measure or measures of the United States, which are or shall be directed by proper authority, or to impede the operation of any law of the United States, or to intimidate or prevent any person holding a place of office in or under the government of the United States from undertaking, performing, or executing his trust or duty, and if any person or persons with intent as aforesaid shall counsel, advise, or attempt to procure any insurrection, riot, unlawful assembly, or combination, whether such conspiracy there threaten, counsel, advice, or attempt shall lead the proposed act or not, he or they shall be deemed guilty of a high misdemeanor, whether it have the proposed effect or not. So in other words, in speaking and writing and printing, in any type of planning against the government or its actions, could lead to imprisonment. A lot of people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were the leaders, wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and their legislatures voted this, approved of it, and they rebuked the Alien Sedition Acts and said they violated free speech. They violated the First Amendment, so they were unconstitutional. And so this Virginia and Kentucky resolution sets into motion this nullification theory that's going to come into play later on, that a state may declare a federal law null and void if it is unconstitutional. That means that a state can cancel a federal law. The Constitution arose as a compact among sovereign states, so the states retain the power to challenge and, if necessary, nullify federal laws. What they were saying here, the whole thesis here, is that the states created the Constitution. The states existed first, so they have the power to say we don't have to enforce a federal law if we think it's unconstitutional. And that's what nullification means, the act of making something void, or the act of a state in abrogating a federal law, avoiding a federal law, or canceling a federal law, or refusing to abide by it. The nullification doctrine was a theory espoused by southern states before the Civil War, advocating a state's right to declare a federal law unconstitutional and therefore void. So what we see here is the beginning of this argument of states' rights versus national rights. The states' rights wing of this argument believed Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and theory of nullification were correct. If the national government passes a law that states determine is unconstitutional, then states can declare the law no good. They can cancel it. States can cancel the law and refuse to enforce it. Well, these national rights advocates like Alexander Hamilton and later on a few other people, Supremacy Clause, they believe the Supremacy Clause states that the Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be the law of the land, and that judges in every state shall be bound thereby. So they believe that the Supreme Court of the United States, the judicial branch, should interpret that law and say whether it's going to be declared constitutional or not the states. So that argument is going to be very much a part of the upcoming Civil War. It's going to lead us to a Civil War. Alright, and then it says explain the importance of the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams, and it says, and we went through all this, and it says the development of political parties, Alexander Hamilton. The rise of political parties. Alexander Hamilton is going to become the leader of the Federalist Party, and Thomas Jefferson here is going to become the leader of the Democratic Republican Party. The difference between the two, Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, he favored bankers, financiers, and industrialists. Thomas Jefferson's group were yeomen farmers or people in agriculture, poor people. Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists thought that the corrupting influences within our country were the poor, the uneducated, the landless mob. He called them the mobocracy, or John Adams did. Thomas Jefferson thought that the corrupting influences in our country were greedy bankers, financiers, and industrialists. And Alexander Hamilton thought that mob was a threat to property and hindered the country's financial potential. And Thomas Jefferson believed that the elite were greedy and willing to trample on individual rights to make a profit. Under the Federalists, the national government should be powerful in relation to the states. The Constitution does not forbid, but it permits the national government to do things. And then the opposite of that, Democratic Republicans under Jefferson believed that states' government should be powerful in relation to the national government. That the Constitution does not permit, it forbids the national government from doing things. And then over here, Alexander Hamilton believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and he would use the necessary and proper clause to strengthen the national government. Jefferson's intentions were to use a strict interpretation of the Constitution. He would not use the necessary and proper clause, and his goal was to weaken the national government and allow the states to powerful reign. Jefferson believed in an economy based on farming, but the Federalists under Alexander Hamilton believed in an economy based on manufacturing and shipping. So those are the difference between these two parties that developed. Even though George Washington said don't develop political parties, the Federalists under Alexander Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson are going to form an opposition to one another. Look, today we see a picture of Alexander Hamilton on a $10 bill and Thomas Jefferson on the $20 bill. And we can even see pictures of Thomas Jefferson on the nickel. There's the front and there's the back. And we're going to talk about this Louisiana Purchase in the next unit. Here's Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home in Virginia. And there's another coin, commemoration coin, $1 gold coin for Thomas Jefferson. And he's also on the $2 bill. Okay, real quick, let's look at this. Which side is which? Okay, which is Thomas Jefferson, which is Alexander Hamilton? Which side is the Federalists? Which side is the Democratic Republicans? So we see say no to the National Bank, say yes to the National Bank, strict interpretation of the Constitution, promote agriculture, promote manufacturing, and loose interpretation of the Constitution. So which side is which here? Which party and which leader? Okay, if you said Jefferson was on this side over here and these were the Democratic Republicans initiatives, then you were correct. If you said Hamilton over here, these were the Federalists, then you were correct. Okay, that's the end of Unit 2. I hope this helped you. Alright, Standard 5e, explain the importance of the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. There's that semicolon. Include, there's that magic word again, the Whiskey Rebellion, non-intervention in Europe, and the development of political parties, and it has in parentheses Alexander Hamilton. So the first president we want to talk about is George Washington. If you remember, he presided. Alright, explain the importance of presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. Include the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion is important for us to understand. Here it is highlighted. Let's first talk about what happened in the Whiskey Rebellion. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of Treasury under George Washington, passes an excise tax on liquor. And out in western Pennsylvania, some farmers were growing some grape. Of the Constitutional Convention, overcame many obstacles during the American Revolutionary War and the crossing of the Delaware and all those obstacles he had. He never gave up. He showed leadership as a military leader. And in 1789, after the Constitution had been ratified, the first electoral college elected him unanimously President of the United States. He received 69 of the electoral college votes, and those were all of the electoral college votes. The vice president was elected separately, and if you look down here on this map, John Adams received 34 votes of the 69 out of all these candidates, and he becomes vice president of the United States. Grains and head stills, and they were making liquor and whiskey And this is going to anger a lot of these farmers in western Pennsylvania. And these angry farmers go out and tar and feather tax collectors. Pour tar over them, throw feathers on them. It took a lot of skin off when that come off, killed a lot of them. They went out and stopped court proceedings just like Daniel Shays did, but this was